Commissioner at the Commission for Gender Equality. Thank you for being with us, Busisiwe. What is the Commission's stance? And here we have a school who's supporting a learner, but from what we understand, that is not always the case. Sometimes very difficult for these learners. Just tell us how this is playing out at schools.
Thank you very much for having me. Well, the existing draft guidelines, whilst they focus on accessibility and costing, which within the South African context are important pillars in relation to access to education, they do not have a focus, or do not have rather a human rights approach in terms of non-discrimination relating to the wearing of school uniforms. And as you've said, the wearing of uniforms, particularly the gender segregation or the division between boy uniforms and girl uniforms, often results in a very differentiated application of the guidelines. So as some schools you've mentioned will be willing to adjust their guidelines, other schools that might have a homophobic and transphobic slant might want to apply the guidelines in a very strict manner and therefore deny children the right to access education based on those guidelines. So what we are asking for, or the view of the Commission, is that the Department of Basic Education must include the right to non-discrimination within the existing draft guidelines in relation to uniforms.
The Western Cape Education Department said they are publishing guidelines, and that will focus on your gender identity, the right to express your identity, and it's against discrimination. But surely we need something bigger. How many provinces have moved towards that, or should this be done at a national level?
I think that's a very important observation. Whilst the Western Cape is moving towards some sort of guideline, and we have to note that this is not a policy, so it is still left up to the school to decide the level of adoption and application. And policies, as you know, in law have a much stronger hold. In addition, whilst the Western Cape, we welcome the Western Cape's progressive stance, we cannot address this in a piecemeal fashion, because what happens is that then in the rest of the country, schools are generally left to their own devices, and usually what they would do is rather stick to the existing guidelines rather than attempt to address some of the gender diversity issues that a student brings within the school.
So you would prefer this to be hard and fast policy. Some are saying it should be fought because that would in fact be in line with the Constitution as well.
I think it should be a very a hard line that the Department of Basic Education takes. This is not controversial, where this is simply asking for the inclusion of the rights that children are entitled to. You must remember that the Constitution places the interests of the child as paramount. That is, in all matters relating to children, their interests are of paramount importance. And so this is not asking for unique inclusion or an extension of already existing rights. It is asking for the application of the rights that already exist and that children are already entitled to. It's not controversial. It's not seeking to create something new and that is not catered for. It's saying that children have certain basic rights, the right to equality and the right to access education, and that should be reflected in the uniform policies nationally.
How many schools are allowing children to wear a uniform in line with the gender that they choose? transgender learners may want to wear pants or skirts to emphasize their gender. That's the case in the school we're talking about. But could it be easier to come up with a policy that says let's rather be gender neutral, or should it go further and the kids can decide what they want to wear?
Well, I think there's room for both, but I think that a gender-inclusive uniform that is gender-neutral is much more inclusive and is a much more reflective of the existing constitutional principle of non-racialism and non-sexism. And I think that we should be moving towards the design of uniforms that are gender-neutral and do not emphasize the differences between boys or girls. I think that would be a much more, so I hate this word, but progressive step forward. But in the meantime, I think that where a student expresses a particular gender expression, there should be accommodation within a school policy for them to wear the uniform that reflects their gender expression, plain and simple.
And there's even comfort here. I mean, girls who identified as girls sometimes don't like skirts. I remember being cold throughout my school career in winter. Finally, we know there is a problem with bullying. Homosexual, transgender kids still being targeted. Do you think it'll make a significant difference here if we go the way of gender-neutral uniforms? Is that somehow linked to the underlying attitudes here, or somehow able to start changing those?
Well, I cannot unfortunately give you a definitive answer, but certainly it will remove some of the obstacles that trans students experience, particularly around bullying and intimidation. But also it removes the power of homophobic and transphobic educators from depriving children the right to access their education. And so these are very important ways in which students can be protected. We're not saying, I mean, in the statement by the CGE, we noted a study that really studied in depth the level of homophobia within South African schools. I don't think we're going to address that through one policy, but it certainly does remove the power and the ability of a teacher to determine a child's future by depriving them access to their right to education.
Thank you very much for your time. That was Busisiwe Deyi, a commissioner at the Commission for Gender Equality. Let's recap your top stories now.